Hey guys, what's going on? Andrew coming at you. I'm really excited. This is the second episode of my podcast series. The title of this podcast is going to be Ontological Shock. The ontological shock is when your entire worldview is challenged. Now, a few weeks ago, I mentioned in a video that I believe the United States was getting closer to some form of disclosure. Now, my goal today is not to convince you that there are aliens in the sky coming down, as much as I want to convince you that there's enough here that even skeptics should also think it's a great idea for Congress to investigate. Because one thing that is a fact that we cannot deny is there are physical crafts in the sky that our pilots cannot keep up with, that there's claims that they're jamming their radar. These things cannot be denied. And it doesn't seem like the Pentagon is being honest with Congress. And it's a little bit to me like who's in charge here, because I think that whatever military programs are happening, there should always be congressional oversight. And then finally, what I'll say is if David Grush, the whistleblower, is lying, then I think that even skeptics should support that Congress is able to look into this. They can go so they can walk in where allegedly these craft are and prove him wrong, because then he goes to jail. Because I've seen a common trend here, and that is I've seen very, very highly intelligent people, people with science backgrounds, physics backgrounds, completely laughing off this subject and also showing to me that they haven't really looked into this issue. Because I believe if you just take 10, 15 minutes to look into this issue, to just look at the evidence, not theories, evidence, most people will be convinced that this is something that should be looked at. And my final thing is, I want to go through each claim that people are making about this that are the naysayers, because I believe we live in a world now where most people, even highly intelligent people, don't read the news. They just see a title on an article, and then they think that's the news. They go to the next title. People don't really click on news articles and read them and engage with them as much as they used to. I hope to go through some of the negative things that I've heard where people are talking about. One, David Grush didn't answer any questions in front of Congress. He just kept saying, I needed to talk to you in a skiff. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the claim I've seen on TikTok and other places that these UFOs are only being seen in the United States. We're going to talk about how can something so highly advanced crash? Because these are the three main claims I hear. And then number 4, I hear that why are these crashes only happening in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere? Why aren't they happening in major cities? So we're going to talk about those 4 claims. Now, first thing I want to say is that, David Grush and 2 fighter pilots, Ryan Graves and Commander David Fravor, spoke in front of Congress. And let's just take David Grush out of the equation for the second. If we don't believe David Grush's claims at all, here are some things that Ryan Graves said. And I want to point out that in my personal opinion, eyewitness sighting by fighter pilots, some of the best pilots in the world, is highly credible. And for people to say that eyewitness testimony or just eyewitness isn't evidence, in the United States, people have been sentenced to death only based on eyewitness testimony. So yes, I believe it's evidence. Ryan Graves mentioned that the United States military was engaging in UFOs or UAPs, which is the new term for this, over the oceans in Virginia, the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean. And he says they were engaging with these things every day.
As we convene here, UAP are in our airspace, but they are grossly underreported. These sightings are not rare or isolated, they are routine. Military aircrew and commercial pilots, trained observers whose lives depend on accurate identification, are frequently witnessing these phenomena. The stigma attached to UAP is real and powerful and challenges national security. It silences commercial pilots who fear professional repercussions, discourages witnesses. It is only compounded by recent government claims questioning the credibility of eyewitness testimony.
When they changed their radar systems, they were able to see these things much more. The way he's described these craft, the most common one would be basically a sphere within a translucent cube. And basically the fighter jet got so close to the cube, 2 fighter jets actually had to move away. They almost hit this object. They reported it to the military because they thought it was a safety issue. It was never followed up. For people saying that these are just drones, and they could be, it's very interesting to point out that Ryan Graves has said that they observed these things being stationary with Category 4 hurricane winds. And these things tend to have unlimited loiter time, and that basically means they're able to stay stationary for days at a time sometimes. Whereas fighter jets, I don't know a lot of people know this, but you can usually only fly them for a couple hours because of the costs of fuel. So even if something like this was an advanced drone, the energy systems just don't completely make sense to us. Then we talk about Commander Fravor, who engaged with the Tic Tac UFO in 2004. And this is probably the highest credible UFO case that we've had in modern years, because there were 3 witnesses that have seen it, so 6 eyeballs on this. It was tracked on multiple sensors, and it was captured on video. David Commander Fravor engaged with this UFO and followed it all the way down. It bounced around on the water like a ping pong. There appeared to be white water under the water that looked like there was something under there.
So the whitewater stood out in a large blue ocean. All 4 of us, because we were in F-18Fs, so we had pilots and Wizzo in the back seat, looked down saw a white Tic Tac object with a longitudinal axis pointing north-south and moving very abruptly over the water like a ping pong ball. There were no rotors, no rotor wash, or any sign of visible control surfaces like wings. As we started clockwise towards the object, my Wizzo and I decided to go down and take a closer look with the other aircraft staying in high cover to observe both us and the Tic Tac. We proceeded around the circle about 90 degrees from the start of our descent, and the object suddenly shifted its longitudinal axis, aligned it with my aircraft, and began to climb. We continued down another 270 degrees, nose low, where the Tic Tac, or we considered 270 degrees to where, and we went nose low to where the Tic Tac would have been. Our altitude at this point was about 15,000 feet, and the Tic Tac was about 12,000. As we pulled nose onto the object, within about a half mile of it, it rapidly accelerated in front of us and disappeared. Our wingmen, roughly 8,000 feet above us, lost contact also.
He engaged with it. It flew circles around him. It disappeared. It traveled 60 miles in 1 minute and went to his cap point. And for you that don't know, that are not into aviation as much, a cap point is where when fighter jets take off, like on a ship or something, they keep circling around. The cap point would be how the fighter jets can fly in formation. They just keep meeting there, and suddenly they're in formation. So even before we get any closer, I believe that their testimony is credible enough that this should be investigated. And their whole point is that there is no safe way to report UAPs, and especially because I've talked to commercial pilots about this as well. There are commercial pilots seeing these things every day as well, especially if they're flying from, let's say, Los Angeles to Hawaii. They're seeing them over the Pacific. And a lot of these cross-Atlantic, or if you're flying across the Atlantic, a lot of pilots are seeing these things that they can't understand. But they have no way to report this. And they fear retaliation. There's been some cases where commercial pilots who have reported this had their jobs threatened. Same with those that are fighter pilots. And so the whole idea is that we need more transparency. So again, if you're a skeptic, I think it's important to point out that there are things in our sky and it's an air safety issue. We should investigate this a little bit further to see if we can get to the bottom of what's happening. So first of all, the first thing I'm going to just knock out of the park now for a lot of skeptics is the term I kept hearing that this is only happening in the United States. I don't know where this came from. I saw this a lot on TikTok because this is not the case. This is not only happening in the United States, but I think one of the reasons it's being engaged with more with our military has to do with a lot of these sightings are seen over the ocean and over our Navy ships. And I think it just makes sense because the United States has the world's largest Navy. They're all over the place. It makes sense that they're being engaged with. But it's just a simple Google search, and you can find a lot of credible cases in Europe. I mean, if we just use Sweden, for example, there was a Swedish fighter pilot, I believe in the 1960s or early 70s, that engaged with a Tic Tac UFO. He saw the same thing Commander Fravor was talking about, and he engaged with it over the Baltic Sea. There's plenty of ghost rocket stories in Sweden from like the 40s, 50s, and 60s. You have the Belgium wave triangles that were seen over Belgium over multiple days, where where their military even released a photo.
Approximately 140 UFO sightings were reported. Hundreds of people saw a majestic triangular craft with a span of approximately 120 feet, powerful beaming spotlights, moving very slowly without making any significant noise, but in several cases accelerating to very high speeds. In short, The Belgian UFO wave was exceptional, and the Air Force could not identify the nature, origin, and intentions of the reported phenomena. Thank you very much.
So these sightings are happening everywhere. It is a worldwide phenomenon, whatever it is. The most common object that is seen is a sphere. I didn't know this before, but Arrow, one of the U.S. companies that are like investigating this, or not investigating it, they're part of Congress that's investigating this, stated that this is the most common sighting, which is interesting to me because I saw a sphere, a metallic sphere over Linköping, Sweden, where I'm at. I don't believe that it was man-made, and what really struck me was it was completely stationary. It didn't move at all, which if it was a balloon, it would still move with the wind. So I found that to be very interesting. I observed this thing for about 5 to 10 minutes, and in that time, it never moved. So that has always convinced me that something's going on. I kind of put it in the back of my mind, but when they were talking about these spheres being the most common sightings worldwide, my heart started pounding just a little bit. I was like, holy crap, maybe I saw this. So I feel like we got to that part, but now we need to get into the part about David Grush, and I'm going to talk about the two other points I wanted to point out to skeptics. Now, David Grush's testimony is a little bit harder to take in, unless I think you know a little bit more about the facts, because I've been following this story since 2017. Since the New York Times article came out that Congress was already secretly investigating this with a program called ATIP that was being funded. They set aside secretly a couple $1 million to be able to look into this issue. They had a man named Lou Elizondo investigate this. He came out to speak publicly because he actually resigned in protest because he didn't believe the United States was being transparent with the people. And he kind of helped start this ball rolling with also former intelligence officer Christopher Mellon. So the people I'm going to talk about on here are people that are very highly credible. These are people that have been working within the military and would have a need to know. David Grush is not some just wackadoo off the street. He's the highest ranking intelligence official with the highest levels of clearance to ever go public. And see, this has been a process because Congress was investigating this and it got leaked in 2017. But some of these whistleblowers were starting to reach out to Congress and say there were no protections in place for them to come forward. See, when you're in the military and you're working on these black projects, they make you sign what's called an NDA, which is a non-disclosure agreement. And these agreements, they face extreme retaliation for talking about secrets. So, for example, they can lose their pension, go to jail. Some of them fear, injury or their lives. This is what they claim. I'm not saying this is true, but this is what they claim. So when Congress got all of this, they kind of put together a whistleblower law to protect them from being able to give Congress classified information. Basically, the law says you can speak to Congress in a closed environment, in a SCIF, if you will, and give them classified information, and you can't go to jail for that. So that's what the law was in place. What many people aren't aware of, and these are all going to be facts I'm talking about now, is that David Grush had been speaking to members of Congress for over 2 years. This is not something that just randomly happened. There were a lot in the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is like the top 8 people that get the highest level of like secret information from the government. He had already kind of came forward and spoke to them. And then he filed a whistleblower complaint with the Inspector General, and the Inspector General has like such a high classification that you can tell him everything. And after David Grush gave him everything he had, the Inspector General said that David Grush's claims were credible and urgent. So we're just focusing on David Grush now. I'm not saying whether what he's talking about is true or not, but that's where we are right now. But here's a couple other things that makes me believe there's a lot more to what David Grush is saying, which again, maybe people that just like looked at an article real quick or didn't actually watch the hearings were not aware of. And that is that there have been multiple whistleblowers with first-hand knowledge, people that allegedly saw these crafts with their own eyes, worked on these crafts, or touched these crafts, who have already spoken to the Inspector General, and they have spoken to some members of Congress in private.
Do you think these hearings on Capitol Hill will spur more whistleblowers to come forward?
I do, Elizabeth. Absolutely. I think that could be one of the next important steps that we're going to see is that other whistleblowers, some of whom have already given testimony to Congress, they might decide to go public. And others may come to Congress now that they've seen what happened at the hearing yesterday.
This is why, if you watch the hearing, you'll notice something very historic, because I notice a lot of people that are skeptics and making fun of this, oh, this is just a distraction, is you had AOC, one of the biggest liberal leaders, and Tim Burchett, like a hardcore Republican, working together. Democrats and Republicans were asking very good questions and taking this very seriously, and that is because Congress knows more than what they're saying. They have a good idea of what's going on. They've seen enough credible evidence at this point that they believe that something's going on, at least with these black projects, and it should be investigated further. Because what David Grush is allegedly saying is that this non-human technology was taken from the military, given to private contractors as a way to hide this to Congress. So a lot of people that are talking about this and joking about this, I will say one more thing, and I feel 100% confident in saying this, like I did in my previous video, because I've been following this behind the scenes, so I kind of know a little bit more about what's happening at the moment. And I think it's very fascinating too, because we are witnessing a war between Congress and the executive branch. Because the Pentagon and Congress are at war of who's in control. And I think it's an important question to ask, because if Congress can't get answers, who's running the country? How is it that Congress and people on the Senate's intelligence community cannot get this information? How is it so secret that our leaders can't get it? Who is really running this?
Several months ago, my office received a protected disclosure from Eglin Air Force Base indicating that there was a UAP incident that required my attention. I sought a briefing regarding that episode and brought with me Congressman Burchett and Congresswoman Luna. We asked to see any of the evidence that had been taken by flight crew in this endeavor and to observe any radar signature as well as to meet with the flight crew. We were not afforded access to all of the flight crew. And initially, we were not afforded access to images and to radar. Thereafter, we had a bit of a discussion about how authorities flow in the United States of America, and we did see the image. And we did meet with one member of the flight crew who took the image. The image was of something that I am not able to attach to any human capability, either from the United States or from any of our adversaries. And I'm somewhat informed on the matter, having served on the Armed Services Committee for 7 years, having served on the committee that oversees DARPA and advanced technologies for several years.
It's an interesting claim to me. But what I am aware of what's going to happen next is that these whistleblowers, some of which have already testified to Congress, are about to go public. And so suddenly it's not going to just be David Grush. It's going to be other people supporting David Grush. And I think it's going to get harder and harder to call those people liars. And see, David Grush was the first one. The goal of this hearing is for other whistleblowers to see how whistleblowers will be treated. So it's a very critical time, and it's very important. Now let's talk about the frustration. Oh, David Grush couldn't answer questions. He kept saying, I have to talk to you in a skiff. Well, I'll tell you this. David Grush, if he answered every question he wanted to publicly, he would face jail time. This is just a fact. There is certain information that he can't give because it's so classified, which is even what the fighter pilots said, where they said everything related to UAPs are so highly classified that if you're a fighter pilot and you just had your phone out and you saw like a little UFO and you took a picture on your phone, that would still be classified, even though you're not using any sensors on the plane. Which, because I can understand maybe not wanting to show like a 4K photo of something that you've seen that's like a UFO or something like that because you don't want to give away sensors. But I don't think stuff like a camera photo should be classified. So, and let's just take that out of the way. Like, let's just forget the fact that everybody in Congress, Democrats and Republicans, the first time I've ever seen it in like 20 years, we're working together. You know, let's just forget that for a moment. But to me, that spoke huge amounts of volume. Now, in the regards of his claims, I find him to be very highly credible. I don't see any reason why he would lie under oath and risk his career. And I don't see any reason why Congress would not ask him any silly, like if Congress didn't believe him, they would have asked different questions. But let's take all out of the way and let's talk about the Disclosure Act of 2023. So while all this was happening, even before the hearing, mind you, Chuck Schumer, who is the most powerful ranking Democratic senator, proposed a change in one of the foreign defense laws called the Disclosure Act of 2023, which states that the United States and the Pentagon have to start declassifying UFO records from way back because they're no longer going to be a problem with national security. They should be released to the public. He said that they need to be more transparent with the American people. And if you actually look at this bill, it's very interesting because it talks about non-human intelligence and what classifies as non-human intelligence. It talks about non-human tech and what the type of these vehicles are. If you look at the language there, it is very, very specific and to me very clear that Congress knows more than what they're saying and they knew exactly how to word it and that they've had help doing this. And for Chuck Schumer to do this, by the way, there's no way he would have done it without approval of the White House. So the White House is involved as well. Now, I don't think President Biden's going to come out tomorrow and start talking about this because we have a campaign coming up. You're not going to have Biden talk about this unless there's undeniable proof. And I believe that, we need undeniable proof. I get that for the skeptics out there. I totally get that. But I don't think you're aware of all these steps that have happened to this point. And this is why I think David Grush is very credible. But for those of you that don't believe, that's fine. I'm telling you, more whistleblowers are going to come forward relatively soon. Now, the only mistake I made in my previous podcast is I believe this was some type of planned disclosure. But I realize now this is not necessarily the case. I think what's happening now is this was such a secret for so long since the 1940s. Whatever UAPs are, we know that they were keeping them a secret. That's almost a verifiable fact at this point, that they were always studying this, but not being completely transparent with the American people. I think what's happening on the inside is that people who were in these positions of power had a belief of secrecy. But now you have people in high levels of a government that no longer believe that it's ethical to keep this a secret from the population. So now you have people, it's like a war happening from the inside where there's over half the people now, I think, that don't want to keep it a secret, which is why you have Lou Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, and David Grush, Ryan Graves, Commander Fravor. You have a lot more of these people coming forward and speaking open and to the public. And one thing I find very interesting is what David Grush said is that there has been a disinformation campaign by the United States government to keep this a secret for many years. And what's interesting to me is I see so many highly intelligent people laughing this off and making fun of this topic, but let's be real for a second. If you were a fighter pilot 10 years ago and you wanted to talk about UFOs in the sky, no one would believe you, and it would unalive your career completely. The same with scientists. Think about a scientist 20 years ago wanting to actually study this topic and put sensors up. You would have been laughed at. And that to me shows that the campaign has completely worked. Scientists and people that care about this should want to prove it wrong. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A lot of scientists would never touch this for this reason. So I support science. I want to put it out there. I want our brightest minds looking at this. I want them getting the data. But for a lot of people saying that there's no evidence of this, there's a couple things we have to make clear here. First, the final thing I'll say about David Grush is that Congress was denied access between a private meeting with David Grush and Congress. It's called a SCIF. It's basically a room you go to where no electronics are in it. There's no way that electronics can work in there. A lot of times stuff is on paper. Well, if the Pentagon has nothing to hide, why was Congress denied a SCIF with David Grush? That is something to me that speaks volumes. I think they can eventually get a meeting with him, but it does feel like there are members in the Pentagon that are purposely trying to sabotage this a little bit, slow things down a little bit. That's one thing. Number two, there hasn't been anybody from the Pentagon or anybody that's spoken out to attack David Grush's character. Nobody has called him a liar, which has been extremely interesting to me. That speaks volumes to me as well. Now, A couple other skeptical points. So these are all the things. So again, I hope that I can just convince you that there's enough evidence to at least investigate this. I can't claim what they are, right? I have my own theories on what I think they are. I might talk about that in the end, but that's just a theory of mine based on my personal belief, and that it doesn't have a science background to it. So the one claim I often hear is like, if these things are so advanced, why do they crash? And I would answer like this. If 2,000 years ago, our civilizations, let's say the Sumerians, the oldest civilization that we know about on record currently, let's say they saw us flying planes overhead. Well, first, they would have thought we were gods. Two, they would have thought it was magic. And yet, some of those airplanes crash. Our most advanced technologies sometimes fail. So to me, if there was some other non-human intelligence that was very smart, I think it's quite possible that sometimes these things can fail. Also, just because they're called a crash doesn't mean that these things actually crash. It could have been a malfunction. Something could happen to not allow them to fly. But just keep in mind that I don't think if we keep evolving as humans, I'm not sure we're going to evolve to the point where we're perfect and we can never make mistakes. So that's where I stand as far as that goes. As far as people saying these things are crashing in the middle of nowhere, one of the most famous sightings, Roswell, I always bring this up, that in 1947, in Roswell, New Mexico, that was the only location in the world with bombers that could deliver nuclear weapons. It's just a fact. So, if there was something checking it out, maybe they were interested. Then the final thing is you hear, how could you ever travel these great distances? It's not possible to travel these great distances. Well, I would argue we don't really know if these things are coming from another galaxy. I know that's something we think about, but just to throw it out there, a very common fact that I'm hearing and I've heard from people talking to is this phenomenon is coming out of the ocean. In a lot of cases, these things are coming out of the water. We've witnessed these things going into the water. And one of the reasons they're changing the name to UAP is because they're almost seeing just as many of these under the water as they're seeing above the water, which is very, very interesting. So it could be some type of intelligent life that just lives in our ocean and always had, and we didn't know anything about it. That's a possibility. There could have been something, maybe more advanced that lived on this planet, or maybe something that lives underground we don't know enough about that could be highly intelligent and that we're seeing. So then they didn't have to travel these great distances. Or finally, if you look at string theory, there's up to like maybe 12 different dimensions. So it would be very possible that maybe it's coming from another dimension. Now, I know that sounds like such a crazy claim, but mathematically, it's possible. But let's just talk about space for a second, because this is a claim I hear, like, this is such a great distance. How is this even possible? You can't travel the speed of light. Well, again, if this is all using conventional stuff, that we don't use wormholes, there's no bending of space-time, and just conventional means of travel, I often like to bring up the United States space program, because in the 1960s, we landed on the moon, okay? And then 60 years later, we had the Voyager 2 leave our solar system on interstellar travel. Now, I'm not saying it's made it to another star system, but it is going out to explore space. It is unmanned. Because one thing that's always fascinated me is how quickly this conversation gets shut down. Because if you look at the development of artificial technology that we have now, to me, it's perfectly plausible that an intelligent species could send some type of vehicle with artificial intelligence to check out a different star system. I mean, we're using the James Webb Telescope now to try to find planets that are in that Goldilocks zone that could support life. So we're doing the same thing. So for them to send these drones out, a couple points I'll put in mind. If it's run by artificial intelligence and it's unmanned, it really doesn't matter how long it takes. But let's just take, the closest star system to us that's about, 4.5 billion light years away. Let's say that you could travel 20% the speed of light. Mathematically, it's possible. Let's just put it out there. If this was the case, then some type of unmanned drone could reach Earth in 20 years. Now, it's a long time, I'm not going to lie, but it's possible. Then, let's say you could only go 10%, of the speed of light. It would get here in 40 years. So to me, this idea that unmanned drones can't be observing Earth, that it's not possible, that the distances are so great that we can't see each other, I believe it is possible. Is it likely? I can't answer that. I don't know how much life there could be on other planets. But I'm tired of people taking this away and saying that there's no evidence and laughing this off. I consider myself to be an intelligent person. I'm not wearing a tinfoil hat. I have an open mind. It is very important that we have an open mind on this topic. We discuss it openly and we stop ridiculing people. One thing I often think about, let's say this ends up being true. I feel bad for all the people over all these years that have seen stuff in the sky that have been laughed at, or maybe they face repercussions for talking about this. And then if that's true, if there's really things in our sky and it's some other intelligence using it, I feel incredibly saddened if we somehow find out that abductions are real, that there have been people taken. That would be sad, because I can't imagine going through that level of trauma, being that terrified, and then telling people, and then it's a joke and people are laughing at you and not really having the ability to talk to anyone about this, which this could be one of the reasons maybe this is kept secret. But again, who knows? Yeah. So this is kind of where we are now. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can say that any other skeptics can say at this point. But my hope is at the end of this video, and I'm curious, you can write below. Again, you don't have to think there's aliens. That's not my point. But you need to at least get to the point that there is something very advanced in the sky. Oh, final thing that I'll say, because I know a skeptic's going to say this. It's most likely our military black projects, which, hey, it's very, very possible. But here's the thing, a little history lesson for you. The things we're seeing in the sky now, we were seeing in the sky in the 40s. The things that the pilots are saying now, very famous, like B-2 bombers, like very high-level pilots, we're seeing in the 1940s. So unless you think we cracked the code on some of this technology in the 1940s, this makes this argument a little rough. And then here's the crazy thing. If you go even farther back, you can find sightings from the 1800s in the United States of things in the sky that would resemble like UFOs today. And some people even argue farther and farther back. I'm trying to stay at this point now and maybe not go too far back. But yeah, there's things in the sky that looked very similar, dish-shaped like things that have been talked about even before the 1940s. So again, my point here at the end is, if you're a skeptic, that's great. I don't want to change your mind. I want to convince you that we should look at this, because you should want to prove me wrong, right? You should do everything in your power to prove me wrong. Congress should be allowed to walk in. Well, first of all, Congress should have a secret meeting with David Grush. Let Congress go to Skunk Works and Lockheed Martin. Let's see what's there. If there's nothing to hide, they should be able to see it. And if there is more truth to this story, then I believe it's unethical to keep it from the world population. If you made it to the end of this video, I want you to put "it's not a balloon" in the comments. And again, skeptics, whoever we are, let's investigate this. Let's look at this together. Let's get our best and brightest scientists looking at this. Let's be transparent and move forward. We're adults and we can handle the truth, whether they're advanced drones or some intelligence from somewhere else. Thanks for watching my podcast. Hey,